Hi, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 41. As a reminder, you can now access this series on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and a few other podcasting sites. So be sure to check that out, and that is linked on our various profiles. So, because we are all in the same place at this moment, I have cajoled the full family to make cameos for this episode, starting with my wonderful mother.
So Jenny from Utah asks, what role does sleep play in depression?
Well, wonderful wife and mother of our children, sleep and depression are highly intertwined in that they form a dread, vicious circle. Depression disrupts the quality of sleep. Poor sleep increases the likelihood of depression. Showing those individual building blocks. Individuals during depression have sleep disruption. Most typical is sleep onset is delayed. You have trouble falling asleep. Sleep is fragmented. Or what used to be a really focused on sign of major depression, this characteristic early morning awakening. You have somebody who's exhausted yet day after day, week after week at 5 in the morning, they've been waking up. That's been diagnostic of a major depression. So depression disrupts sleep. And then big surprise, long sustained sleep deprivation increases the likelihood of depression. Not surprising. So let's unpack that a bit. In lots of ways, a stand-in for depression there could be stress. Stress disrupts the quality of your sleep, poor sleep quality, and you increase the likelihood of stress. Stress, or the secretion of stress hormones, glucocorticoids, human version cortisol, these are intertwined with this. Okay, so the first piece of it, lots of stress, lots of glucocorticoids, and you increase the likelihood of somebody falling into a clinical depression. This is seen epidemiologically before people's first major depressive episodes. There are typically major stressors. If you put someone on synthetic glucocorticoids, if someone has an autoimmune disease, an inflammatory disorder, if you're trying to suppress their immune system after an organ transplant, you put them on steroids, which are glucocorticoids related to cortisol. And what do? Among other things, high dose sustained levels of these glucocorticoids increase the likelihood of depression. Third example, there's an obscure disease called Cushing's syndrome, which any of a number of tumors, frequently pituitary or lungs, but the result is you secrete massive amounts of cortisol, and people with Cushing's have a greatly elevated risk of developing a depression. So lots of glucocorticoids, lots of stress as a stand-in can increase your vulnerability towards depression. Furthermore, if you have elevated glucocorticoid levels, even if you are sleeping away the night, it turns out there's different stages to sleep, and there's a particular stage, delta wave sleep, that is sort of very restorative, and lots of stress, lots of glucocorticoids, and you suppress the amount of your sleep time that's spent in the delta wave state. This is some work my lab did centuries ago with a colleague, Craig Heller. So you see that connection there. Then we now have the other side of it of depression disrupting, elevating glucocorticoid levels. And a substantial subset of individuals wind up with elevated glucocorticoid levels. And this is in part diagnostic. And there's something called a dexamethasone suppression test, which is a way of seeing that your cortisol system is not working properly. So an intertwining of poor sleep quality, trouble falling asleep, depression, elevated glucocorticoid levels, all of them go together. Sleep deprivation does something very interesting as well. Obviously, if you go long stretches of time without sleep, you secrete lots of stress hormones. But a classic study, totally cool study, they took a bunch of volunteers, stuck them in a lab and mattresses in the lab or whatever, went to sleep where they were monitoring their cortisol levels and heart rate and blood pressure, things of that sort. And the first group, the control group, said, okay, just sleep as long as you want. And they go to sleep and sleep their 8 hours and wake up spontaneously. Second group, You say, okay, go to sleep, but around 5 o'clock, we're going to wake you up. And what you see is something very interesting. Normally, about an hour or two before you wake up, your cortisol levels begin to rise. Why is it? Because like the most stressful time of day is getting up and getting out of bed and finding your toothbrush and all of that. The normal circadian rhythm is that cortisol levels begin to rise 2 hours or so before you get up. Thus, it's 6 in the morning for these people spontaneously getting up at 8. Tell people we're going to wake you up at 5 o'clock, and around 3 in the morning, these people completely asleep are already beginning to get a cortisol rise, already beginning to disrupt the quality of their sleep. Then the kicker, the third group, the most interesting one, where you say, okay, going to sleep, here's what we're going to do. We're going to wake you up while you're asleep. We're going to wake you up sometime during the night. We're not telling you when. And what you see is right after the person goes to sleep, cortisol levels begin to rise and they stay high for the whole night, telling you unbroken, sustained, adequate amounts of sleep are very good for avoiding a stress response. A fragmented night's sleep, when you know it's going to be fragmented and when that happens, is stressful. But the most stressful of all is unpredictably fragmented sleep. And what's that about? That's about often medical training where you got your medical residents and it's 2 in the morning and they've finished with someone and they get to sleep there and they have no idea if they're now going to sleep for 6 hours or 30 seconds. This is particularly disruptive. Okay, so we've got this tight intertwining between stress increasing the likelihood of depression, depression being a stressor, poor sleep quality increasing the likelihood of depression, depression disrupting sleep quality, all of it intertwined with these glucocorticoids. One final weird domain is what seems deeply counterintuitive in a subset of patients. Severe sleep deprivation will break the back of a treatment-resistant depression, a depression where all sorts of meds have not been working. You do this for a few days. It often works. It doesn't last for long. It's a subset of individuals, and it's often individuals who are having the most trouble with seasonal depressions, people who are most sensitive to the light-dark cycles, and nobody really knows why, but that's sort of a footnote there. But in general, depression, poor sleep, stress, totally intertwined.
Okay, so similarly, Yasmin from Lebanon asks, do you have any views on bipolar disorder being a sleeping disorder in essence?
Yes, in ways that are very interesting and very different from the depression scenario we just talked about. Bipolar disorder, cousin of major depression, persons fluctuating between manic states of enormous energy, often disjointed thought, minimal need of sleep, crashing into depressive phases, and frequently oscillating, often in a stereotypical way. And you could conceptualize bipolar disorder, I think, in two broad domains. The first one, it's a disorder of enhanced sensitivity to reward. And that's where the mania comes from. Second, it's a disorder of circadian clock problems. Circadian clocks, we all have these 24-hour rhythms in us, circadian, Latin, Greek, whatever, circa around the day, I don't know what it is, circadian rhythms. We've got circadian rhythms and we're all familiar with them. You run a fever, you're sick and you're wondering, is the fever gone or what? And you know normal temperature tends to peak late afternoon. Normal at 5 p.m. or so is around 99 rather than 98.6. There's a circadian rhythm to that. There's a circadian rhythm in growth hormone release. Big surprise. You tend to secrete growth hormone when you're asleep. That's when you do your growing. Stress hormones, as we just heard, their levels rise when you wake up as you start the day. So there are circadian rhythms throughout the body. And they're actually quite adaptive because they are preparing your body to do the right stuff at the right time. And what we have is an endogenous, approximately 25-hour rhythm in us, which is shown in all sorts of cool studies. You take some volunteer who agrees to go and live in a cave for months on end without any time cues. They decide when it's time to sleep and turn off the lights. They've decided when they are sufficiently rested and get up. And the messages they have coming down from the surface, from the collaborators, go through some sort of voice synthesizer thing. So you can't tell if somebody's voice sounds tired. Ooh, it's very early. You do studies like that. And what you see is people free run on about a 25-hour rhythm. And what the daily rhythm of the outside world does, the 24-hour clock, is it, quote, entrains you. It then locks you into a 24-hour one. Okay, so circadian rhythms, you take any cell from your body, put it in a dish, leave it to its own devices, and you will see there's typically circadian 24-hour rhythms to enzymes it's making, things of that sort. However, there is a master circadian clock in the body. Big surprise, it's in the brain. Big surprise, it's in the hypothalamus, controlling your autonomic nervous system down your spine, controlling your pituitary and hormones through that route, and a thoroughly obscure subpart of it called the SEN, the suprachiasmatic nucleus. If you say it loud enough, you'll be precocious. The SCN is the master clock of the hypothalamus of the brain of the whole body. So how does it work, and where does bipolar disorder come in? And this was like one of the huge sort of triumphs of molecular neurobiology in recent decades, the molecular basis of the clock in the brain, in the hypothalamus, and the SCN of the hypothalamus. Incredibly heroic sort of research by 3 different groups that resulted in Nobel Prizes for them. And it is such a damn elegant system, you can't believe it. Okay, suppose in the SCN, you've got 2 different types of neurons. This is called an AM neuron. This is called a PM neuron. When it's during the AM, your AM neuron makes the neurotransmitter AM. When it's PM, conversely, and the rule is that these are interlocking gears. The more AM is activated, the more it suppresses PM. The more PM is activated, the more it suppresses AM, and they flip-flop, and you get a circadian rhythm coming out. In actuality, there's like 2 or 3 sets of gears like these running in parallel that stabilize things. Final bit of minutia about the circadian clock, the golden hind, the code of codes, the challenge above all else about it was something called temperature insensitivity. Genes, neurotransmitters, molecules, all of that, it turns out they act at different speeds, at different temperatures. As things get warmer, molecules oscillate faster. Neurons make neurotransmitters faster. When things get cold, everything slows down. How can you possibly have a clock that accurately keeps track of 24 hours all on its own if as soon as it's hot out, you'd be running 23-hour days because everything's moving fast? As soon as it's cold out, exactly the opposite. This was like the grand challenge of the field. How do you find a molecular mechanism that is temperature resistant? And what you see is this totally cool thing of the stuff that makes one of your clock factors and the mechanism by which you break down that stuff. They're coupled. So if it's hot out, you make more of the stuff faster, but you break it down faster. Likewise, if it's cold out. So completely elegant, cool system. So where do circadian clocks in the hypothalamus fit into stuff with bipolar disorder? Some interesting aspects of it. People who have bipolar disorder have completely screwy sleep cycles, typically fragmented late onset, shortened sleep, lengthened sleep, fluctuating across time. And what you see is one of the big precipitating things for someone with a history of bipolar, precipitating to throw them into another episode, is a highly disrupted daily sleep schedule for days on end, staying up way too late and then sleeping 20 straight hours. And that's what throws people into it. And one of the sort of low-rent therapeutic means of containing a bipolar episode is to impose a very rigid sleep-wake cycle, a very rigid feeding cycle, just to try to keep a lid on the circadian tumult that you see going on in people with bipolar. More aspects of it It turns out a subset of people with bipolar disorder have mutations or rare variants in some of these clock genes. Perfect. It fits right into it. The next big surprise is there's an enzyme that fits into this whole clock gene story there called GSK3 beta, glycogen synthase kinase 3 beta, which tells you there's a lot of these GSKs. And this GSK3 beta is playing a fairly central role in keeping the gears moving. And it helped solve a century-long mystery in the field, which is people earlier in the last century stumbled into the fact that lithium is a drug that can help control bipolar episodes. And in fact, for decades and decades, it had the honor of being one of the most used psychotropic medications, along with one of the least understood how it works psychotropic medications. But it was the old standby, and it turns out lithium is having its effects on this GSK3 beta. And then there's another class of drugs called mood stabilizers, lamotrigine, Lamictal, a few others like that, which also stabilize, and they're indirectly working on this GSK3 beta as well. So the pieces fitting their final piece that made me so happy, stress and glucocorticoids impact the working of this GSK3 beta. So you got this whole clock working there. And all this evidence that in people with bipolar, the clock is running a bit amok, and the molecular gears of the system often have something wrong with them. And some of the main drugs that work to control bipolar disorder are tapping right into these clock mechanisms. So it's not so much that bipolar disorder is a sleep disorder, it's a circadian rhythmicity disorder, coupled with its other main component being hypersensitive to reward.
Hi, offspring number 2. Sonali from India asks, is chronic pain psychosomatic?
Well, the usual answer, which is yes and no. Really boring scenario, you can have chronic pain because something is chronically wrong with you, a chronic injury, a chronic compression or fever, who knows what. If the insult to the system continues, the perception of pain will continue chronically, and this is not very interesting. I think what's being focused on here is when something has triggered pain, and when that something is over with, the healing has occurred, the pain continues afterward. Or a perception of pain when there is in fact no insult at all. Is that totally psychosomatic? And that's where we get the yes and no. Yes, psychosomatic in terms of some very cool wiring in the nervous system. What's the easiest way to think about it? You burn your finger on something and your burn receptors there send a signal to your spine, which goes up to your brain and tells you it's a burn, and it's a burn rather than a poking pin, and it's a finger instead of this one. And all of that information heads up there. The system is most easily conceived of as a bottom-up system. Information from the extremities, from the outside world, and the painful stuff it dumps on you to the spine up into the brain. But it turns out there's at least as many projections going from the brain down the spine into all of these pain pathways. What are those downward projections about? They're modulating the sensitivity of the system, which is exactly where the psychosomatic comes in, making some things a whole lot more painful than they would usually be, depending on circumstance, making some others a whole lot less. What do I mean by this? Great example. You have a major dental phobia and you go into the dentist's office, and so much as touching your tooth causes a spasm of agonizing pain because your brain is so sensitized at that point, it is changing the threshold for pain perception in your teeth. Or another example, an example of modulation where you don't perceive pain. Okay, I'm assuming that if most people dropped their pants and somebody came along with a piece of sandpaper and sandpapered the hell out of their butt cheek, they would find this to be painful and aversive. However, in a different circumstance, Virginal children of mine, please cover your ears. Suppose you were having sex in some adventurous, abrasive place, and you're abrading and you don't even notice it. Downward regulation of pain thresholds. Okay, so some of the time, yes, indeed, psychological state is modulating the nuts and bolts about how pain pathways are working. But what you also see outside the realm of something psychosomatic is when you have some kind of injury in the periphery, and long after it is healed, the pain continues, the pain is prolonged. One version of it is a wiring problem producing what is called neuropathic pain. Suppose you get a deep cut that cuts some of the nerves here, and everything's very painful, and the nerves over the subsequent weeks to months are regenerating, and in the process of trying to do that, they screw up and they get intertwined so that one of them gets stimulated with a pain sensation, and it stimulates the other one, which stimulates this one, which stimulates, and you just have a positive feedback loop reverberating pain there. This is one version by which you can get this pain, neuropathic pain. The other is called inflammatory pain. And this one is very interesting because it took a whole bunch of really arrogant neuroscientists down from their high horses, people who studied learning and memory. Okay, stick with me here. Learning and memory, you got two synapses in, for example, your hippocampus, the part of the brain that learns new facts and all of that. And what people figured out was that hippocampal dependent learning of a new fact, what's involved is synapses become more excitable. If this one has something to say, it's lowered the threshold for this one then getting excited and passing on the message. And this potentiation of excitability in a synapse was called LTP, long-term potentiation. Not just because you've learned something, potentiated a synapse, but it's long, you remember it. It lasts for days, for decades, all of that. So LTP and the workings of LTP are beautiful and elegant, and all sorts of brilliant people devoted their careers to understanding hippocampal LTP. And then it turns out you don't just get LTP in the hippocampus, which was this major trauma for the hippocampal LTP people, because it was all theirs and beautiful, and suddenly next door you got the amygdala, which undergoes LTP when you're learning to be afraid of something new, or learning to be afraid of someone new. Then there's another type of LTP that's going on in your reward pathways. Suppose you are an alcoholic and you have been on the wagon for some length of time, and you go back in that place. You go back in that street corner, you go back to that men's club, whatever it is, where you did your drinking, and the craving comes roaring back. The craving is something you have learned and remembered, and you see LTP going on in some of the reward pathways triggered by stimuli, context-dependent craving. Then it turns out you got LTP in your spine as well, in your spinal cord. Repeated chronic pain will cause LTP to happen in some of these spinal neurons, and it remembers the pain and it continues to reverberate long afterward. Where does inflammation come in? Why is this called inflammatory chronic pain? It's because the inflammation that's occurring around your injury area, some of the chemical messengers of inflammation, cytokines and chemokines, are ones that facilitate LTP in pain pathways. So you don't just remember stuff in your hippocampus, you remember to be afraid, you remember to start craving stuff, and some of your pain pathways remember to send pain messages long after the pain has stopped. This is another pathway for a chronic pain syndrome, and these are incredibly debilitating, and that field is crippled by two challenges. One is to get an objective means of measuring how much pain is someone experiencing, some kind of painometer, because the subjectivity of that makes it very hard to study. The other is to get better medications that don't have massive side effects and make you addicted and all of that. But amid that, there's a very, very clear neurobiological basis to pain that persists long after injury. Some of it is bottom up, and some of it is top down.
And that's episode 41. Be sure to find us on your favorite podcast platform.
And keep submitting questions. You can find the form in the Instagram story highlights and bio or in the YouTube video description.
We are the Cher Sapolskys, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.
And happy Thanksgiving from us, the Von Trapp family singers.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.